All right, everyone, welcome back to Feeding Curiosity. We're back with the first episode of the year, but we're going to be talking about Nosferatu, Robert Eggers' variant of or version of Nosferatu. So this movie is very old, or at least the source material of this movie is very old. And so he basically, how would you even describe it? It's not really like the updated for modern audiences, though that's like what I want to say, but that is kind of taken on a bad connotation these days.
It's updated for metamodern audiences.
The way to put it this way is I really want to see more directors / writers like Robert Eggers take on old school stories, because I think Nosferatu was released in the 1930s. It was like one of the first silent films back in that era. And I want to see more stories like this, where you have a visionary director and writer who knows what they want to say, but they're not going to just repackage it in a way that's like cheap. Nosferatu brought new things to the table because just categorically, like vampires and Dracula have been done to death. Yeah, no pun intended. But like we've
and resurrected unnaturally.
Yeah, right. Like we've seen vampires and Dracula so many different ways, from serious, creepy to silly to comedic to basically not even really vampires, but you're supposed to relate to them even though they're vampires, you know. Right. Cue eye roll, or cue, women swooning like, "Ooh, vampires are so dreamy," or they sparkle. This movie, though, on the other hand, was not that. I felt like this, to me, was the feeling I would get with old school horror movies, like growing up, when you would watch something for the first time, like maybe like Alien or Predator, where like it just was unsettling. But now modern, like update that with modern cinematography and just modern sensibilities around the craft of filmmaking. I'm trying to do it like the 10,000 foot view right now. Then we'll dive into the details.
No, I think you're right. If I think about what this movie is, I mean, besides a response to all the terrible or increasingly terrible depictions of vampires, it's sort of a return to form. And that I know Robert Eggers went and read like source material. So what people in the region, what their folklore was.
Oh, actual historical material, not Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Right. Historical material. So he went and read myths from Transylvania of similar creatures. They didn't have like a Dracula, but they had similar stuff. And I think that if I'm not mistaken, I think that the little ritual that you see the sort of gypsy people conduct was something that was actually conducted.
And that makes sense, because I remember like when I was probably around high school, maybe late high school, I read one of like Bram Stoker's like Van Helsing stories, and like Dracula was in it, but like almost throughout all of his short stories was like this motif of the gypsy people, because they were kind of like the storytellers for a lot of this folklore, right? Because they were like an oral history people, where they would just, because they travel from place to place and wander, vagabonds basically, people would just hear their stories rather than like people who lived in cities. You get the caravan of gypsies, and they tell stories of creepy things in the woods. Yeah. Right, exactly. And like you said, that ritual where they sacrifice the virgin, that felt really grounded to Eastern European myth, like around monsters and mythical creatures and all those kinds of things. Like you could almost take that sort of premise, right? Someone goes out to the edges of civilization, at least at that era, and just fill in the blanks with any type of monster, and you could have a cool story,
Right. And in that context, it's the gypsies, the strangers that wander in and out of civilization. They go out beyond the known and bring to you all the stories of the creeping things beyond the city walls.
Yeah. And I thought, like, because some people have asked me to, like, after we saw it, it's like, what did we think about it? And like me and you, we get the deeper story elements and the symbology rather than just like what's on screen, right? Anyone who's watched our podcast know where we're going to go with this. But like getting into the story, it's kind of like world building, almost like fantasy-esque, but without minus magic and some of the esoteric things at the beginning, right? Is it like London or Germany? It's Germany, I think, like a German town. And so what I think they did really well in this, though, is that you really get a sense of the time and place of, and it's like all throughout the story, but in the very beginning, you get a sense of who the main protagonists are for the rest of the story. But like the initial sequences of like your main character, the wife, his job, and just the setting of the world feel believable. Like it feels believable in a sense for the time period that it is. Like the people feel like they're real versions of who these people might be or might have been. And then we get to like the creepy shit is or at least it kind of hard opens to that, where it's like that dream sequence in the very beginning with the wife kind of hallucinating slash sleepwalking in the very beginning.
Name? I know
that's Lillian Depp. I forget the name of the actor, the name of the character.
Yeah, it opens with her
Ellen.
like having an orgasm.
Yes.
In the theater, we were like, well, hello.
Yeah, right. Like I said, it's totally just like, whoa. He like
I'm laughing now because out of context it's ridiculous. But Robert Eggers is so good because he was able to do that in a way where like it wasn't funny.
Yeah.
It was unnerving. And you'd hear laughs in the crowd, but it was kind of like people going, is what happened? Is this happening?
Right. Yes. It was like, it was awkward laugh. It was an awkward laugh, not like a ha ha funny laugh. It's like, oh, whoa. Like, are we all, and you know what that kind of felt like to me? It felt like when you're on a roller coaster and maybe you're not like nervous or a little bit nervous, but it's like that feeling when you get locked in to the ride. It was kind of like this, like that, like strap in, like this is the kind of story we're going to tell.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Or like when you pull up to a campfire and someone's voice changes and they're like, you know, staring into the fire or something in old times and someone starts getting quiet or something. It's like that. But this is a way of like snapping people into it. Be here.
Yeah. It worked.
Yeah, I thought so.
It brings you to the world. The whole film really does an amazing job. It's part of why Eggers might be my favorite director right now, of bringing you into the experience of people in that age. Like the world that they're in, the movie that you're watching, you're not watching a movie. Like there isn't a hint where the director is aware of the fact that this is a movie, or there's no separation. It's real for everyone all of the time.
I think that's why I was saying it feels more like world building, like a fantasy story, because you're like immersed in it. It's not like you're looking through like a looking glass or something.
Yeah, and he does something that makes me nervous. But all of his films, he gets into the headspace of the people of the time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like what he does is he reads all the history and then reads the mythologies and the folklores and then imagines what it would be like to live in that world on its own terms and to believe what people believe. And then he makes it real.
Yeah. It almost feels like a docudrama in some sense, where instead of being like, this is just a movie, I'm going to do these things for entertainment's sake, it feels like, okay, I've read a whole bunch of these historical accounts or sources, and it's like, okay, now how do I play that story out? Like one example of how someone might be able to craft these mythological things, you know, and this is kind of leading me to believe that we might need to do Northmen at some point down the road, because I think we can tease apart more of this with some of the Northmen's scenes too. And I just really like that story. I haven't watched it in a while, but now I'm like, damn, I kind of want to go watch it. But yeah, I totally think you're right. And like, this is again why I want to see more like directors and writers with vision like Eggers has take on these old school things who are going to do it justice, but also add a fresh layer on top of it. Because it's like back then it was groundbreaking to do Nosferatu, and now it's like it's groundbreaking all over again, but for new reasons or more elaborative reasons. If we take your viewpoint on things, everything's just an elaboration as we go, and now we're able to weave in more things on top of it. Because I feel like this whole story, even though you could pick out certain things, I think you can take many different takes on what these characters or what the symbols of these characters might represent on different levels, which is cool. It's
I think he's familiar with you.
yeah, totally.
Yeah, I saw in an interview with him, and
Was it Defoe?
we're talking to each other. And at one point, Eggers says, "What do you think about early Christian Gnosticism?" And then laughs. And Defoe is like, "You just can't help yourself." Right? So you get the sense that he's been playing in these waters for a while.
Oh yeah,
I see what you're doing, dude. I know what you're doing.
yeah.
It's probably part of why I like it, his movies. But we've talked a bit about how he's getting into the mindset of the characters, that he's world building, that he's creating something that's real. He's taking sort of the experience of the people at the time very seriously, trying to portray that. That looks to me, there's no hint of postmodern irony in that at all. None. Not a second of it.
It felt sincere almost all the way through. There was no break of character in other mainstream movies, the blockbuster movies. As soon as there's any ounce of tension for too long, there has to be a hard cut and a tension relief valve. This movie had none of it. It didn't feel like jump scare horror, though there were kind of jump scary things, but it was more of unsettling horror. You barely see Dracula fully, or Count Orlok in this film. You don't see him very much at all. Like, they use the old school monster motif in sense of like, it's creepier if you only get glimpses or you get very limited viewpoints or angles of this character, and just let the ambiguity build the presence of this basically primal force is really what he is.
I don't want to not talk about this chronologically, but
Okay.
try to abstract out and talk about what's going on up top.
Let's do it.
Just return to the film by reference.
Okay. I like it.
Because if we just go through it chronologically, it's going to be confusing. We're all just recapitulating the thing. They can just watch it.
Right.
In this, Orlok is obviously a big one, is sort of the center of her and Lily Rose Depp. That going back and forth is a major feature. You have Willem Dafoe's character, who I think is he's our in.
Yes.
He's the competent one that understands.
He's kind of like this versions of like, he's almost like a Merlin-esque character, potentially Van Helsing stand-in, at least from like the historical source materials.
Archetypally, he's the wise old man.
Yeah.
He knows where this is all going.
Definitely.
So it's like, I want to start with the alchemy. Because everything else kind of falls in line once you understand that.
Okay, if we can explain the alchemy and put it in its proper place, and then extrapolate everything from that, let's do it.
So that alchemy is an appropriate in, because there is through Willem Dafoe's character.
Yeah.
Him and Birdman.
Right. And I also think the other doctor, what's his name? Doctor, at least character-wise, his name was Sivers. He was the actual like
Ralph Ineson.
Yeah, him. He's also great, and I think he kind of represents the modernist viewpoint, right? Like, he's the man of science. He's this guy who tries to understand things in a mechanistic way, like, but with the limited viewpoint of the period. And so then he's
much more constrained, right? So the other husband.
Yeah, that's Taylor Johnson.
Rational man. He's the rational man. This can't be real. This is ridiculous.
Everything can be explained by science
and all this. So he's also plays the part of a person who puts their head in the sand when evils arrive. In Harry Potter, they have this, like the Minister of Magic, the original Minister of Magic didn't know Voldemort's not back.
Right.
He used like smear campaigns and stuff against people who are saying that Voldemort is back. All of this, right? This has been happening now in modern times, plenty. But it's the same motif. That's that character, right?
Yep.
But Willem Dafoe's sort of are into alchemy. And the reason these are into alchemy and why alchemy matters is because making reference to and drawing an aesthetic and even a philosophy from that world. Now, this is happening in the Victorian era, like 1800s. So it's kind of after alchemy was tapering off, though apparently alchemy stuck around. Is a hermetic philosophy in Germany into that period.
Oh, wow. Okay. So it's relevant to the time period then.
Yeah.
So he might be one of the last people who believed it, or at least one of the people who was part of that wave.
Or like it wouldn't be unheard of that people would have believed those things. So Hegel, for example, was kind of hermeticist. Anyway, with that being said, alchemy is a weird, it's a proto-science.
Mm-hmm.
Carl Jung thought of it as an undifferentiated mix of psychology and chemistry or medicine. And so for Jung, the further back in time you go, the less differentiated the world is in general. And at some point, right before the Enlightenment, it's really in the Enlightenment that subject and object get separated. Descartes doubts until he can doubt no more, and then there's mind and matter, and he's a dualist. And they're two distinct things.
Yeah.
And he has to come up with a bunch of bullshit to try to say how they operate with each other. I think he says that it's through the pineal gland and it's magic.
Oh, wow. So he looks for like the actual physical mechanism of how it...
Yeah, of course. It doesn't matter. You're just kicking the can down the road, because if you say that mind and matter are like separate things, but it's from the pineal gland is matter. What are you talking about?
I was going to say, I'm like, what do you mean?
Right. So before Descartes, you could say that one of the things that hadn't been differentiated in the world was the subject and the object.
Mm-hmm.
So what alchemy was doing was playing with objects and sort of not knowing what they're doing, fumbling around, but coming up with all these theories about what's happening. So if the theory isn't in reality, it's not even informed by reality, you're not even doing chemistry. Sometimes you are. Sometimes you're coming across it.
Yeah, accidentally.
Yeah. But other times you're not. You're just coming up with shit. Then what are you talking about? Where's this coming from? It has to be a fantasy. And so if it's a fantasy, it gives us insight into the mind. And so Jung looks at it from that standpoint. If it's not science, it's fantasy. He's interested in the fantasy because that tells us about their psychology. Within alchemy, there's a sort of series of sets. So one of the alchemists that Willem Dafoe's character mentions is a guy named Paracelsus.
Yes, that's the name.
Paracelsus was a real guy. His full name was Philippus Areolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim.
Okay, what a name. What a name.
Yeah, wild name. It's much easier to say Paracelsus.
How do they get Paracelsus out of all of that?
I was pseudonym.
It's got to be.
But you'll notice that Hohenheim also gets referenced in Full Metal Alchemist.
Oh, you're right.
So that's Paracelsus is that Hohenheim. But the Hohenheim in real life was much more egotistical than that character.
Jeez.
In fact, Jung talks about him. He seems to think about Paracelsus as a guy who made contact with unconscious contents and then believed himself to be the generator of those contents, so that it inflated his ego. He thinks that he's the genius instead of thinking like the Romans did, you had a genius. It's a different framing. Right? So for the ancient Romans, it was that on your birthday, they didn't celebrate your birthday. They celebrated your genius.
Like a spirit within you?
So you weren't a genius. Nobody was a genius. It's the genius worked through you. By the way, the word genius in Latin, right, is a Latin word. Its equivalent in Greek was daimon. It was the daimon that Socrates listened to when he refused to leave Athens and instead yell at all the senators.
Is that the word that's spelled daemon? Like it's D-A-E? Like
it would be demon, but it's,
it's the A-E.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen, okay.
Daimon.
Okay, that makes more sense.
Demon in English later.
Right.
The meaning of a demon is
It's
not
totally
the same
changed.
time. It's it's the Roman idea as a genius.
Right. And is that where we get the word genie too? Like
Yes.
genius, genie?
Yeah.
I don't know why I never thought about it that way, but it makes so much sense if they thought of it as like an embodied spirit that could give you good luck, or
Right. And all
gifts.
the classic genie stories, it's that they're all sort of monkey paw stories, right? It's enormous power with dangerous possible consequences, right? Be careful what you wish for is always
right. That's always the the lesson.
Yes.
It's okay. That's what these are for.
Paracelsus did something like come into contact with the genius in him and all these unconscious archetypal contents, think that he's sort of those things, and then gets inflated up to like megalomaniac god level, right? So a modern equivalent would be Kanye West. Comes a proper creative, uniquely creative, very open. He's experiencing things and he is getting invaded by them. Jung warns about this as being the ego being assimilated by the unconscious instead of the ego assimilating the unconscious. So you can get sucked up into it instead of you staying above it and then controlling it. So it's something like all these ideas, all this unconscious content is flowing into your experience and you don't know how to make sense of it, and it's just drowning you. But the way that, in some sense, that Paracelsus dealt with this was by thinking it is him, by expanding himself and really giving him a god complex. Now, that might have been necessary because 1517, Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the door at the castle church at, I think it's Wittenberg, and began the Protestant Reformation. This is an era of revolution, right? 10 years after that, in 1527, Paracelsus takes the canon of medicine, which had been established for like 200 years as the canon in the authoritative literature on medicine, and he burns it.
Jeez.
Yeah, so this is a revolutionary time, and Paracelsus knew about Martin Luther, and he said something like, I'll leave Luther to his revolution and I'll do mine, something like that.
Dang. So they were both kind of like doing their own thing at the same time.
He was the collapse of the church's authority.
Yeah.
Because it used to be
crazy.
that medicine was a top-down thing. Is that there was a theory and you stuck with the theory, and everybody tells you that this is just debate about the theory. It's already decided. Paracelsus had traveled a bunch and went to a whole bunch of different local regions. And so he was treating sort of things on the ground. He thought that you need to witness nature as nature is and then draw a theory out of that.
Oh, because they were thinking like, we already know how it works, so we just apply the theory over and over again.
Right? And if something didn't work, it's because God didn't favor you or because you did it wrong, and that's it.
It couldn't be the theory is wrong or flawed or whatever. It's just you with those who are administering said theory are flawed.
Yes. Right. And now this is a rebellion against that. So you see how it's bottom up now, and it's the emergence of science, right? And science is the same thing. You have to look at nature itself, take it for what it is, and then derive a theory out of that. You can test your theory by bringing it as a hypothesis to nature and then testing it against nature and seeing if what you think would happen happens. But you're always comparing it against nature.
Right.
You see how the science is emerging.
Dang. That's so cool.
I know. And so, okay, so he burns the canon of medicine in 1527, right? Fire is not random here. There's a deep symbolism in Paracelsus's thinking and in alchemy at large about fire, what fire is, what it is symbolic, what it means, what fire means. And I think in Psychology and Alchemy talks about a famous text called the Aurora. It was an alchemical text. And there are these 14 principal virtues, including one called goodness. But this is so cool. The word for goodness is ben ignitus. Okay, so ignitus, fire. Ben, like benevolent, good fire.
Oh man, this fits perfectly into the story.
The story. It's going to start unlocking stuff. So they have this idea, right? That fire is, in alchemy, you have a baptism by fire.
Mm-hmm.
And what fire does is it separates and does away with any unnecessary thing. So one example, when Adam and Eve are kicked out of Eden, there's an angel, a cherubim, who's put in front of Eden with a flaming sword. A sword cuts and burns, right? Yep. So the symbolism's there. Right? To get back to Eden, you would have to be differentiated and burned off. When Moses encounters the burning bush,
man,
the bush everywhere, on fire and not consumed, right? And when everything is burning, the part that isn't consumed in that story is God.
Okay.
You see, when everything is burned away, all the unnecessary parts of you, all the lies, all the bullshit, all the addictions, all the unnecessary whatever is all gone. What's left is God. The equivalent to that thing in alchemy is the Philosopher's Stone. That's what they're mining. They are mining for the Philosopher's Stone. And there's a process, they call it, this is perfect. You can see how they're early chemists using the tools of chemistry, both to do chemistry and to do a spiritual thing. A process of distillation, where you go into the unconscious, sort of, stuff is burned off, heat rises, and back again, back again.
Yeah, repeated until you get something pure.
And what's left is pure. That's the idea. It's part of why gold is what's made out of the Philosopher's Stone. It's gold. Gold is a pure metal.
Right.
So all that symbolism is there. And you'll see that there's here, I'm going to quote you in a little bit. So this is, I think this is either his Paracelsus or his Psychology. Fire destroys all composite things and infuses their images back into the air in the form of smoke.
Yeah.
So it burns away everything and it becomes this one.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it separates out the bullshit, burns it all off, and you become one person. This is sort of the spiritual idea of alchemy. Right? And that they say that the Philosopher's Stone is Christ, too.
Interesting.
So, right, the thing that isn't consumed, burned but not consumed, is God. That thing is also the Philosopher's Stone, is also Christ.
Yeah, just different versions of the same thing.
Right. It's super cool. So back to the movie, right?
Yeah.
If you can understand fire as that, fire is the thing that destroys the rot. It burns away the excess. Then you understand why when they encountered the bodies of the husband and wife back in the catacomb or in the mausoleum,
yep,
they had done some unsavory things. So he lights it in fire.
Yeah, it's like
I don't remember if he lights that in fire.
They light and they find the original grave of, or the casket of Orlok that was brought to the castle.
And he's like, redemption, redemption, redemption. And he's screaming redemption while everything's burning.
Yep.
Okay. That's pure alchemy.
Yeah.
That you'll be redeemed by burning off Peterson says deadwood. Like he's using that metaphor straight from
it reminds you too, because like when they brought in the Doctor, William Dafoe's character too, right? The modern representation of doctors at that time kind of reaches his limit, right? Because the wife, Ellen, at the time, she's basically catatonic. She's like raving mad in her sleep from her dreams, still basically having orgasms in her sleep. And he's at his wit's end and he's sedating her through modern theory of the time that, well, she's just going through it. Keep her sedated or tied her to the bed, whatever it is you need to do to keep her from hurting herself or others or whatever. And as soon as they bring in William Dafoe's character, he's like, no, you need to not do that. Like she's basically clouded by whatever is going on.
And I think that sounds to me appropriate from that point of view. That it would be that the ego, if we're being really psychoanalytic here,
Right.
that what the ego needs to do is to become more solid against the tidal waves of the unconscious. And so to literally inebriate her is working in the opposite direction. But one thought about her somnambulism, if I her sleepwalking and all this.
Yes.
She will take on the voice of somebody else, right? And she gets demon possessed. Okay, so what's that? Think about well, sleepwalking is one example of this, right? You're unconscious. So are you acting? What's acting exactly?
What's controlling your body if you're not in conscious control of it?
Imagine that you get really angry and you yell at somebody. And you even say things that you don't mean. Like you say things that you consciously do not believe. And you'll say, I'm sorry, I don't know what came over me. Okay. Implicit in that statement, I don't know what came over me, is a hierarchy of agents in the mind. And so you have agency generally. And then there are times when something beneath you gains an enormous amount of power and then takes over control of your human system and speaks through you. Okay. That's something like the demon here.
Yeah, what they're like this possession type motif they kind of talk about, or at least that's what they call it, I should
There's
say.
an unconscious content or fantasy that has gained so much power that it's overwhelmed the agency of her. This isn't the rules of the film in the world of the film. The world of the film, it's just Nosferatu and evil demon magic. Right. But if you're being sort of taking a step back and thinking about that in a contemporary context.
Yeah, in a broader sense too.
Right. And this is something you might see in schizophrenics.
Right.
Which for Jung is somebody who's sort of been dissolved entirely by the unconscious. And so they speak in its language and they're living in a weird dream state.
Mm-hmm.
Another example might be people who are suicidal and they jump off the Golden Gate Bridge. Some of them will survive. And those that survive will tell you, oh, I immediately knew that I didn't want to die.
Yeah, almost all of them regret it, the immediate, like the seconds after jumping.
So death is a fantasy that's indulged and reinforced time and time again, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger until it takes control of the human system and makes them act it all out. Now, there's a difference. It's worth noting also that I think most suicides happen around 3 a.m. They're sleep deprived. The strength, right? The strength of their ego isn't there. Their self-control isn't quite there. The fantasy, like a dream, begins to take over the system, and then they act the dream out, and then they kill themselves.
Jesus.
Now, the thing, why is it then if that they don't want to really die? Why are they dreaming about death? For Jungian, death has a symbolic meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And it might be that you need to let something go, right? Let it die.
Right.
That there's something about their life. It could be that they've gone so far in the wrong direction, they don't know how to fix this, and they just need to let go of that entire life. They need to let it die. They need to let their personality, as they have it, die.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's trying to, in some sense, communicate with the ego what it is that needs to occur.
Right.
But they're probably repressing it, not listening to it. It's getting bigger, and then it slowly overwhelms the system and then takes them over. And so they act on a dream. They act on the symbolism. But when the symbolism is acted out in real life, then you end up dying.
I mean, I feel like the story even kind of is a microcosm of this too, because even in the beginning of the movie, she says that she's like, I dream of death, trying to beg for her husband not to go. And then like throughout the entire story, even though death is personified to some degree, but you can look at Orlok in many different layers because she dreams of him and there's a connection between the two of them. And the surface level theme is that it's like repressed desire, which is time period appropriate for women at the period of time, right? Women aren't supposed to be, at least anywhere what we would consider modern takes of sexuality. And then along with that, we have the visual motifs of rot and decay and the plague that spreads throughout the city, which is another motif of death or consumption, I guess, is another way of putting like desire. And then you have people falling back to primal urges, which is kind of desire. It's like it makes you more than what you are. So it's like maybe the literal thing is she's not able to feel like she has the desire in her, but she's not allowed or willing to like say yes that yeah, I do want these things. And so then it manifests all of this in this crazy demonic like possessive nature, right? And we can get to the end once we wrap up, but because there's a lot to say, I think, there with how it actually ends.
There's a big piece that we should touch on because it brings us to Orlok, and it also explains why Orlok has to be burned away. So desire, right?
Mm-hmm.
She has some underlying desire that's ruining her life.
Mm-hmm.
There's a really cool idea in alchemy that Jung used in his practice, where they said that all the unconscious content, you couldn't make sense of it without a theoria.
What does that mean?
He uses that word specifically to avoid saying theory, like you would translate it as theory, but it didn't mean theory like we think of it. It meant something like a encapsulating image.
Like an image of the self or something like that?
Yeah, I'm going to give you one in a moment. An image that frames the thing that you're seeing in its meaning, and you go, got it.
Mm. Okay. Mm-hmm.
And that the way that you help somebody make sense of these things is through amplificatio, so amplification. And amplification is exactly this. So think about Count Orlok. Notice that he doesn't bite the neck. He bites the chest.
The heart, specifically.
He says that he's an appetite.
Mm-hmm.
He's consuming her heart.
Mm.
Okay. Do you understand what the meaning is? Right? That she has a desire that is consuming her heart.
Aha.
Right. So that's what I just did there by pointing out notice that I didn't have to explicitly explain anything. I just tell you what's happening.
Yeah.
And now I amplify that. You get
a desire of the heart, I guess we would call it. But again, it's like this is what I was kind of getting at in the very beginning when I said it's like same, but in a new way, right? Because he could have just done the biting of the neck thing, the typical vampire fashion. But instead, he is deliberate and chooses a new location, right? Because he even did this when he was feeding off of the husband, and the husband is being like mesmerized or something, and he wakes up and he thinks it's a dream or a nightmare or something, but then he like looks at his chest and he's got the bite marks there, but then he leaves, right? Like, so we're kind of seeing the same thing happening in different ways, right? Whereas throughout the story, you have the wife is falling deeper and deeper into darkness, so to speak.
More and more consumed by an unconscious desire.
And the husband is going in opposite but parallel directions in some sense, because he goes into hell, survives by jumping into the water, which is a cleansing motif for Christian
baptism.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
He goes right to a bunch of priests.
Yes. And I thought they did that scene awesome. I thought they did that really well, of like them trying to explain what it was to him, but he was too panicked to.
So he survives this overwhelming desire that's consuming his heart by an act of purification and like sanctification, right?
Mm-hmm.
Through some spiritual process that clears it. So you can think of that like a 12-step program.
Yep.
It's like you being consumed by your alcoholism.
Mm-hmm.
What did they say? That a man takes a drink until the drink takes the man?
That's a phrase.
Great, isn't it? I saw a really good art piece. I think it was a sculpture that looks like a face sort of in water, but the way that it's formed makes it look like the whole thing is inside of a bottle.
Oh, dude.
It's like a man being lost inside of a bottle. Right?
Yeah.
See, again, so you have a desire that gets built up that can get to a point where it now has agency over you.
Mm-hmm.
It acts and it's sort of on your behalf for its
Yeah.
own purposes, or not in your behalf at all, it'll kill you. But the way that he gets out of that is through a spiritual practice and kind of baptism. And so that's something like what he calls it.
I guess we could call it like a baptism by fire, because he goes into the belly of the beast, literally,
He gets
and
a baptism
survives.
by water.
Yeah.
The water, right? There's a baptism by fire in this. The only baptism by water that occurs in this movie is that.
Yes.
The rest is all fire.
Yeah, because even the husband who's the rationalist fails, like he falls to his baser instincts and then
Yeah.
has to get burned because he fails, basically.
He has to get burned. So let me.
I was just using it as a
That's
juxtaposition.
the water and the fire
Yeah.
thing. The water purification is a Christian motif.
Mhm.
The fire purification is an alchemical motif.
Yeah.
Now there's still water symbolism within alchemy. And it's very, very similar to the water symbolism in Christianity. In that you have to, in a Jungian alchemical viewpoint, it would be the water is the unformed unconscious, uncontacted. Right?
That makes sense, because you can't hold water in your hands, right?
It's fluid.
Right.
It's deep. Right. You can't fathom its depths, kind of a thing.
You haven't contained it yet.
Right. Part of the Christian symbolism would be that the way to redemption is to go into that, to make full contact, right? To dive head first. So there's still a version of that going on in alchemy, but they put more of an emphasis, as far as I can tell, on the fire element. That you make contact with the water, but you have to distill it by heat in order to get the pure.
Because even water can be impure, so you need to distill it to get to the most pure version.
All the different, by fire, by water, all this kind of language is all to get at this idea that what you have to do is sort of get into yourself and make contact with the things about you that you don't want to know.
Yes.
And then purify yourself. Go through a period of the, what is it? A dark night of the soul. Right?
Yeah.
So the husband, the rational husband, would be an example of a person who is in denial. He's in constant denial, not just of evil, but of his own evil, of his own desires. He's straight-laced. He's a conservative man. He's got it right.
And he's done everything right.
He gets blindsided by it.
Yeah.
Someone who, because they are in denial for so long, when the reality becomes undeniable, they can't handle it. And then he falls into this appetite, and then that's it.
Yeah.
Which he was never prepared for. So this is such a crass example, but it'll work. It's like the Catholic girl.
Yes.
Like the girl who grew up in a very strict Catholic family, maybe went to boarding school, no sex. This is very good. And in the moment that she gets some freedom and she has the opportunity to do that for herself, to make that decision for herself, boom, just collapses into the craziness.
Right. That's exactly. That's
exactly that's like what's happening to him. Is that you're not dealing with it, you're not integrating it into your personality, learning how to contend with it, and so when finally things get a little too stressful, and now your grip starts to loosen, you can't white knuckle it anymore. Right. You let go, and now boom, into the thing you collapse.
That was exactly what I was about to say. It's like that person who's just white knuckling themselves through life, just like trying to keep themselves together from like, this is what society wants me to be. This is who I'm supposed to be. I got two. Right. But it's like they never allow themselves to see, either let them lose control or be seen as someone who can't be controlled, because they're a fine, upstanding citizen. Like, they follow the rules, and if they follow the rules, they'll have all the whatever someone who follows the rules gets in this society. Yeah. At this period of time, whatever you pick your period of time, right? It doesn't matter what it is.
What you'll actually get is a collapse into your appetites, and then your whole person, you might just die.
Right.
And that happens with people. People, they're not just the Catholic girl, but guy that's been working this job for 20 years, and a round of layoffs come by, and his whole personality implodes, and now he just drinks himself right to death, or falls into an opioid crisis. Whatever it happens to be, this happens to people. So the narratives of this kind really do a good job.
I think this is where we should get back to Birdman.
Birdman he's not somebody who's trying to be an upstanding citizen.
Right.
He worships the appetite.
Exactly. This is someone who looks at the worst thing or wants to elevate it. Right. And I mean, kudos to the actor for playing this part. And I think, to me, he feels like the modern day version of Igor.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I've been thinking about it for like weeks at this point, and I'm like, wait, he's Igor. That's who he is. Like, because he's the guy who worships the master, right? And he wants nothing more than to be the master, but he'll never be that, because this primordial force, pick whatever it is, he can't be that because he's mortal, just like you or me or anyone else.
And he treats him like God.
Yes.
Right? Is right.
Mm-hmm.
So God is this appetite to him, right?
Twists him.
And creature it turns him into.
It's like Schmiegel almost, right? Like he turns himself into like a Gollum-esque character.
Yeah, Schmiegel worships power, and he becomes a sniveling little powerless thing. It's not clear to me. He becomes an agent of consumption.
Yes.
Right. He's consuming everything. He'd be something like gluttony.
Right. And he wanted to, he even says it like right before he dies. He's like, I wanted to be the king of the rats. So he doesn't even think himself, like, he thinks of humanity as rats probably, or something similar to that.
He's lowered himself to the level of a rat.
Right. So he has such a low opinion of himself. He can never be even on par as to what this central thing is.
The statement that he, like, we never, it's so annoying because the words that we use now, we don't understand what they mean. And so if I call somebody a rat, I might be like, he's a narc, or I don't like him. But we don't, because we're not in contact with nature or rats, certainly in that way.
Intuition about it. Right.
Experience with this sort of thing. Imagine that we share a certain number of capacities with a rat.
Mm-hmm.
We definitely do. It's part of why we use rats for research before we use whatever we're doing, testing on the rats on humans.
Yeah.
Because we share some capacity. Now imagine that you could pursue something wholeheartedly, your entire being. And that in pursuing that thing, not all of you is necessary. That a very, very limited amount of your capacities as a human being are necessary for the pursuit of that object.
Like you strip away all the things that make you human and just become mammal, which is saying you're just an animal.
You're an animal. You don't have any capacities beyond what an animal can do.
Right. It's your frontal lobe.
And people would take umbrage, or I think that's the word. Umbrage with that. If that's what you're doing, that's what you're doing. You can be butthurt about it.
I mean, look at what drugs do to people, right?
Look
drugs do.
When somebody is a degenerate, that doesn't just mean that they do gross shit. A degenerate is somebody who's doing exactly this process. That they're limiting themselves. They're reducing their capacities.
Yeah, totally.
Right? So they are degenerating into an animal-like thing. And
right.
You can become so fractured that you're sort of whatever the desire is in that moment. And so you're all eating food in one moment. You're all just chasing sex in the next.
Right.
But there's no integration between those things. So it's not that you're Joe Schmo up here and that happens to have these desires underneath that occur, even healthy desires. It's that you are hunger, you are thirst, you
just are the base instincts, and there's no, like, to use Viktor Frankl's words, there's no time between stimulus and response. You just play out whatever. Yeah.
And I think so. There's a motif of this in Greek myth. I think it's Actaeon is the guy's name. A hunter sees Artemis nude. She turns him into, I think it's a deer, and then his own hunting dogs rip him apart.
Yep.
Okay. So that myth of being torn apart is super, super common. That myth is a beautiful woman turns a man into an animal and then disintegrates him.
Mm.
Like, so you could think of Birdman as a version of that. A man who's obsessive worshiping of an appetite reduces him down to the level of a rat and then kills him.
Right. Yeah. And then I think from this point forward, we should then pull back in the one of the last conversations before the basically last climax of the film, but the conversation between William Defoe's character and Ellen, where he kind of lays it all out and says she would have been like a priestess of Delphi or some sort of, muse like communicator with another world. And I think that that ties into your alchemy story of all of this stuff because I think it's getting at something that we've basically don't understand in contemporary terms anymore because it's so outside of modern sensibilities, or I don't even know what you call it, but it's if you're just not used to it or even religious, you're just gonna be like, what the heck? Like that's just esoteric as hell.
Oh, the whole movie.
Honestly, you're right.
Like, I love it because I'm like, oh, there's it.
Yes.
There it is. Perfect. But it's I can imagine if you know nothing about alchemy, one, you're basically just like everybody else.
Yeah.
Definitely the norm. But you might bounce off some of it or just not.
Oh yeah.
You might intuitively get it, right? You watch it and it makes sense on some level, but you couldn't explain why it makes sense.
That's why I wish we had Jordan here for reasons we can't. But I wanted to see if he would get some of these theories
I know
at an intuitive level.
It turns out that LA is experiencing its own baptism by fire right now.
Yeah, yes, actually, quite literally.
So he can be here because his house might be burning.
Yeah, but we'll have to talk to him offline, or we might do a round two talking about. Maybe we'll do like a whole thing on Eggers's works because he's watched a lot of his other stuff, which might be worth our time.
That would be awesome.
Foreshadowing, but back to what we were saying is like the Oracle of Delphi type imagery of the Ellen character in this story. Because I think it's important to say that because I think it's going to go over people's heads. In my thing is my thing, and I think it's telling.
I think that in some sense that's exactly what she is. I mean, this is the problem with symbols. You can read this in a bunch of different ways, and it's actually valid.
There's no really wrong way. It's just some might be more accurate than others.
So it keeps it's right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So there is a structure there.
Right.
It'd be like the syntax, but you can change out the words. Right. So the semantics can change. So you can read it non-alchemically exactly, but you could read Orlok like a rapist. If he rapes her, it drops her into a kind of sexual overload desire that ends up consuming her. Right? So that would be a way of kind of reading it in a slightly different format, but it doesn't have to be.
Mm-hmm.
Right? What wouldn't be appropriate would be like, I'm trying to break the logic here. Like if you said it was a spiritual journey for her.
Right. Yeah. Like she went on a journey that was positive.
But like if you really said spiritual, it would be wrong.
Right.
Because spiritual is above, spirit, air, all these things, a pursuit upwards.
Yes. She wasn't ascending at all in the story. She was sinking into herself.
That's exactly right. Right. So you could invert it and then try to make an argument for the spirit, like this, that she's ascending here, but you'd just be wrong. Yeah. But it would be like, no, clearly not. And so she is going into herself. There is an Oracle of Delphi kind of thing going on. Willem Dafoe's character calls her, said that she would have been a good priestess of Isis.
That was what it was.
And I don't remember what Isis's deal is. I don't know.
Yeah, that's the Egyptian goddess.
Motherhood, protection, and fertility. Okay. So I can kind of see it. Sure. But anyway, the idea would be that, okay, so imagine that the Greeks made a difference between Olympian gods and like chthonic forces. Chthonic means from below.
Like underworld?
Yes. Right. So Hades would be like a chthonic god.
Yeah.
And that, if you take that psychologically, it'd be things from within. It is the appetites. It's also
Mm.
the Furies come from our chthonic
Mm-hmm.
tormentors. They'd be something like guilt,
Ah.
right? So they come from below. But wisdom can also come from below.
Oh, interesting.
The idea is that the self, the philosopher's stone, Christ, God, is beneath all of it. You said something like, you have to see what supports you and you can no longer support yourself. And the implication there is that that thing is God.
That's
Right? So you can make, if you're an oracle, you're doing something like trying to make contact with that part, or trying to communicate, allow that part to communicate through you.
right.
So you could go to somebody who was like a fertility goddess, who was given herself up to the purpose of child making in one way or another, and you can, she's consumed by that part, and then you talk right to that capacity.
Right.
And that capacity exists across many, many people, and so in some sense, you get to talk to it instead of an individual, and you experience that thing in you as well.
Yeah. And I think part of that is like in this story, she's out of sync, right? Like she's either afraid to recognize it, or just by the cultural standards of that period of time has to repress it.
Yep. It's the Victorian era.
Right.
Out of this era, Freud emerges,
Mm-hmm.
and he writes Studies in Hysteria with Brewer. And it's a whole bunch of women that have gone hysterical. They're just telling all these case studies about this. But imagine that it's such a repressive time that everybody's trying to white knuckle it, and people are just breaking left and right.
Right.
Okay. So she's sort of a prototypical Victorian hysterical woman.
She's always been like this. It's just another one of her bouts or whatever.
Right. But the thing would be that she's another version of like a Catholic girl, or for whatever reason, she's collapsing into her desires. It's actually, or her appetites, right? It's, this isn't a positive thing. That's why it's a horror movie. It's horrifying to see her succumb to that.
Yes. And you even the one scene, like when it was like right after Orlok says like 3 nights I'll come, and if you deny me 3 times, I'll kill everyone you love. And then she tries to deny him by reaching out to her husband, and she's like basically hysterical.
Oh yeah,
that scene was wild.
What an incredible acting job.
Also, yes, they put everything on out to make that scene possible, because that was unsettling to say the least.
Her and Birdman did unbelievably well.
Yes,
with their craziness.
Yes,
and Willem Dafoe's character was Skarsgård playing Orlok. It's perfect.
Yeah, to get
top tier.
I mean, all the acting, and just having a director who lets actors do try shit that's just kind of crazy, and just the effort that went into it. You know, it's refreshing to say the least. All we haven't really talked about at this point is kind of the last scene, and if there's anything to pick apart symbolically, or at least the ending, because William Dafoe's character kind of has the theory of like she has to like basically sacrifice herself with the creature, or this spirit, whatever you want to call it, creature, spirit, whatnot, demon, and then if it's there by sunrise, and I don't know, is it either or and if they burn the ground in which it was buried, or the casket,
destroy its resting place.
Yeah, resting place. I don't know if it was or an and. I can't remember
the source, right?
Yes.
Right. So they're burning the source of the problem, so to speak. She has to die,
basically,
and then the sun will rise.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a new dawn.
Yeah, she has to sacrifice herself.
Right, the light comes again.
Also, ironically, the sunrise, another way of cleansing of the night, darkest before the dawn, so to speak.
Return of consciousness.
Ah.
Right, so she's made unconscious by her desires, and that something else is aware, in some sense, where she's not aware of the desires that are consuming her, or somebody else is in control. It's the agent. the way that this thing is overcome is by a death. So in the movie it's literal, but psychologically it'd be that it's an ego death, ego dissolution, die.
Yeah, that's what I thought. At least at one symbolic level.
And that's the only way to, if it's taking up too much of you.
Right. There's only one way out.
Yeah. Right. It's not a literal. In the movie, it's literal. Like she.
Right.
But in symbolically, it's not literal. At least it doesn't have to be. Right. It's that you have such a radical transformation of personality that the you that you were is dead. You're not that person anymore. And then you can continue forward. And like, this is like the people that are smoking addicts for 35 years and they take a heroic dose of mushrooms under guidance of a clinician and they just annihilate it. One dose and they never smoke again.
Yeah.
And so they experience something so radical that it shakes off all their bullshit.
Right. It punches through barriers or... Interesting. Any other parts that you haven't discussed or highlighted yet?
There are things we could talk about. We don't have to go on to every minute.
Yeah, I mean, we could always revisit it if needed because there's always going to be reasons. Like, there's we're going to have plenty of times for you to keep elaborating on this stuff.
Oh my God, an outlet?
I mean, you did that with Arcane. Now you're doing it with this movie.
It's interesting how much is popping up.
I know. I mean, it seems like we're I don't know. Someone has got a finger on the pulse, or at least there's something reemerging within the. Because as soon as you were saying some of the other stuff, where it was like the ego, you can fall into the baser instincts of you, right? Like something takes over when you get angry. That motif actually appears in Dune in the later books, not in the first book, but in the second book. So, yeah. Cool. I didn't want to bring in Dune again, but I just finished book 4, so I had to throw it in there for anyone who cares. So, yeah, I mean, there's never-ending things to cover, but this is our first thing of the year, and I think it was a good one to start the year on, to be honest.
Great movie.
Yeah. Honestly, if we get more horror like this, kind of this return to form, because we didn't really talk about there's other people who would just go to that level, but like if you just want to appreciate this for like a horror film for horror movies sake, it's totally viable. It just so happens that there's more richness just beneath the surface to be able to elaborate these things.
Yeah. And I don't know if Robert Edgar, if he ever hears this, which will never happen, I don't know if he knows this, but he needs to start making Faust. That's what he should be. That's the thing. That's the movie for him.
That's his next movie? Or his... I'd love to see that. Well, that'll do it for our deep dive on Nosferatu. To be continued. If anyone else has any other suggestions on movies, as always, or shows, etc., we're all ears. Until next time.